This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
Hello and welcome to Invisible Hate. I am Saadia Khan.
And I'm Asad.
And our story today takes us to Sydney, Australia in December of 1988. Scott Johnson stands at the top of a North Head cliff, his clothes folded in a pile beside him. He stands face to face with 18-year-old Scott White. The air is full of tension, the argument heated. Before Johnson can react, the 18-year-old's fist crashes into him, knocking Johnson off balance. He feels himself stumble backwards, his feet sliding through the rough sand. He digs his heels into the ground, attempting to steady himself. But Johnson only continues to teeter backwards, propelled by the momentum of the punch. He soon finds that he can no longer dig his heels into the ground. In fact, he soon finds that the ground has dropped out beneath him. And suddenly, Johnson is falling. This is Invisible Heat. Welcome back to Invisible Heat, a weekly true crime podcast in which Asad and I attempt to uncover the ugly truth behind various hate crimes, both recent and historical. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. We are very excited to have you in this space. And if you are a frequent listener, thank you for coming back.
Wow, Saadia, you're so grateful this morning.
I am humbled this morning, Asad, and I will tell you why.
Yeah, tell me why. What's going on?
So, Asad, I was at this event yesterday. It was a meetup between founders and funders. And it really, really humbled me.
Oh, wow. What happened? Oh, my goodness. Tell me more.
I just realized that a lot of investors are just assholes. And if they don't like your elevator pitch, like the first few seconds, they will glaze over, they will ignore you, they will become fidgety. And then you're just standing there thinking, why am I here? And then you just have to suck it up and, move on to another investor and do the same thing again.
Yeah, I've organized things like this before.
That's really
funny. Oh, yeah. So wait, how long was it 30 seconds? Was it a minute?
It was an informal get-together. So basically, you just go up to them and start talking about your venture or whatever you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they are nice and they will listen to you. And other times you can just tell that they are bored and they don't want to engage in this conversation. And it was humbling us because normally when I do these elevator pitches or if I am pitching to somebody, it's a Zoom call or a Google Meet. Or if I am meeting somebody in person, it's pretty targeted and I know who I am meeting. And so I'm prepared accordingly. But it was just such a humbling experience. And it taught me one thing, that whether you like somebody's pitch or not, whether you think you will invest in their venture or not, be kind, be gentle, right? Because whoever this founder is, they've put their heart and soul into their project and their work. So that's why I am feeling a bit humbled in the morning. But you said you've organized these. Talk to me about it.
Yeah. So, my life has been organizing these kind of connections between startup founders and investors and partners and all that kind of stuff. I've been doing it for about 10 years. And I remember vividly a friend of mine, I did one of these, we called it mentor speed dating at the time. And basically the mentor told him to shut down his company and go back to England where he was from because it wasn't going to be a successful venture. And so, yeah.
That's brutal.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think a lot of it's, the kind of tough love. Some people are assholes. Some people are testing you to see how you'll react. I think a lot of people are also like as much as they are an investor, maybe they're just also socially awkward and don't know how to engage with founders as well.
Oh, that's a good point. That makes me feel better.
Yeah, so I definitely know a lot of investors that are like that as well. So, including me at times. I feel like
Well, that was a fun segue, I said.
Yeah. Anyway, so back to invisible hate. As many of our frequent listeners know, a lot of the cases that we discuss involve crimes committed against minority groups. Our goal is to determine through a discussion of the nuances and complexities of the situations whether or not they should be considered hate crimes. We'll have a discussion about this case at the end. Today's case is a little bit different from the cases we typically cover, as it takes place in Australia, involving the death of an American PhD student in Sydney. The case itself also contains a fair amount of missing information, just stuff that we weren't able to glean, partly because nobody saw the crime happen. As a result, you'll find that some aspects of this case are somewhat speculative rather than concrete. But with that, let's get started. Saadia?
It's early December 1988. The exact date is unclear, though it is believed to be sometime between December 8th and December 10th. 27-year-old American PhD student Scott Johnson meets 18-year-old Scott White, who's Australian, at some sort of hotel or pub in a suburb of Sydney, Australia. The relationship between the two and the reason for their meetup is unknown. The pair then go for a walk around the North Head cliff tops, located near Manly, a beachside suburb of northern Sydney in the state of New South Wales, Australia. At the time, North Head was known to be a gay beat, a popular gathering point for gay men looking for discreet, consensual public sex. So this is a place where they met up to have sex publicly, basically.
Yeah.
As a result, many gay men were also targeted by homophobic gangs and individuals within this region. Unfortunately, these very cliffs were the site of various attacks and killings during this time. These points are relevant to the case because Scott Johnson was an openly gay man. Johnson and White soon end up on a cliff top where Johnson stands naked. According to the Boston Globe, his clothes sit folded on the sandy ground beside him, along with his shoes, watch, ATM card, student travel card, bus ticket, and a $10 note. Now, an argument suddenly breaks out between the pair and the air fills with tension. Before Johnson can react, the 18-year-old's fist crashes into him, propelling Johnson backwards. He stumbles for balance, teetering back towards the edge of the cliff. Johnson attempts to steady himself, as anyone would do, but it's too late. He's run out of ground. He tips over the edge, the ground dropping out from beneath him. For a brief moment, he's airborne as he falls down over the edge of the cliff. And then, in an instant, Johnson is gone.
Oh my goodness. What a horrible story, Saadia. Just at 27 years old to die in such a way. I'm assuming he died falling over a cliff. Oh, unbelievable.
Yes, absolutely. And imagine being so young and standing with somebody that you probably know, and then an argument ensues. We don't know what the argument was about.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time, how these things can escalate so quickly. And obviously, we weren't there. We don't know what happened. But for the results to be so consequential is so sad. Can you tell us a little bit about Scott Johnson, the victim of this crime?
Absolutely, Asad. Scott Johnson was born in 1961, the youngest of four. Johnson, his brother Steve, and his sister Terry grew up in the Los Angeles region. However, the family struggled financially and moved frequently as a result. Johnson was very close to his brother Steve, who described him as, and I quote, effortless thinker who loved to hype. He was shy and humble, yet incredibly intelligent. According to the Boston Globe, in 1983, the young man moved to England where he studied mathematics at the University of Cambridge. So he was pretty smart. There he met Australian musicologist Michael Noon. The two soon fell in love. After graduating from Cambridge, Johnson returned to the US where he enrolled in a PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley. However, soon left UC Berkeley in 1986 to join his beloved Michael Noon in Canberra, Australia. So that's how he moved to Australia.
Oh, he followed his heart. He went there for love.
Exactly. There he continued his PhD endeavors at the Australian National University. Johnson was known to be a very smart person. One of his economics professors called him a brilliant mathematician. The same professor once wrote a letter which was shared with the Boston Globe saying, and I quote, "In my lifetime, I do not expect to meet another individual possessed of Scott's brilliance and quiet modesty," unquote. What a phenomenal combination, Asad. A lot of times, people who are brilliant can be assholes.
Yeah.
So Johnson was not just brilliant, he was modest. A rare combination.
Yeah, seems like a really great guy, like outrageously smart, like everything say, really sad. What can you tell us about Scott White, the perpetrator of the crime?
So Asad, basically, White was just 18 years old when his punch sent Johnson off the side of the North Head Cliff in Australia. According to both The Guardian and CBS News, White was considered a street kid at the time of the killing. He's believed to have been a somewhat damaged teenager. Again, I don't want to use this term, but that's how he's described, perhaps contributing to his aggression that fateful day.
Yeah, I mean, street kid, damaged teen, like, you gotta love the juxtaposition that the media uses for the perpetrator versus the victim. I mean, we were kind of doing it here as well, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, but it could also be true, Asad, right?
Yeah.
Going back to White, he soon married a woman named Helen, though the couple later separated. Today, White suffers from early onset of dementia caused by excessive alcohol abuse. And Asad, this next point is extremely interesting. According to the LGBTQ news platform Advocate, White now reportedly identifies as gay.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess I would have just assumed that he was because he was meeting Johnson at the top of the cliff, but maybe, I'm wrong. So was White engaged with relations with Johnson, making it like crime of passion, or was it internalized homophobia, as we've discussed in past episodes, or just a straight out crime, like he was targeting Johnson for whatever reason? Do we know any of this?
Great questions, Asad. But for now, let's take a break. And when we return, we'll be discussing the investigations and trials and answer all your questions.
Oh, can't wait.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
Welcome back to Invisible Hate. So I just asked Saadia a series of questions about this case that I'm interested in knowing about. Saadia, how was Johnson's death discovered? Any sort of investigation that followed? You were going to talk a little bit about that.
So according to the Boston Globe, Johnson's body was discovered at the base of the cliff on December 10th, 1988 by a 13-year-old boy spearfishing with his father and another man. Johnson's clothes and personal belongings were found in a pile on top of the cliff. As for the investigation, unfortunately, the police made very little attempt to investigate. In 1989, an autopsy determined that Johnson had died of various injuries sustained in the fall, which makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
But the coroner ruled that the young man had taken his own life.
Oh, they're saying that, yeah, he committed suicide by jumping off the cliff. Oh, that's interesting.
Exactly, Asad. Now, according to the Boston Globe, Johnson's brother Steve was essentially told, and I quote, "Your brother jumped, man. Really sorry. That's what gay people do."
Oh,
Steve and his family obviously refused to believe that Johnson had committed suicide. There were so many things going his way. I said, why would he, right? Johnson's sister Terry is quoted as telling the Globe, and I quote, "It was Scott. Come on. There's no way." So his family refused to believe that he would do something like this.
totally. Yep.
After this, Steve, Johnson's brother, began a consistent and tireless effort to get the North South Wales Police Department to reopen the case and reinvestigate his brother's death. That must be so hard, Asad.
Yeah, we see this, at least in the States a lot too, of families that have to be, on top of the police and investigators to get them to remember and prioritize their case. And, I think in this case, it seems like the police kind of made assumptions and decided what happened too early. And other times, I'm sure that police are just kind of overwhelmed and are understaffed, and it's hard to prioritize all the horrible crimes that are happening in your area. But yeah, good on him for the brother for pushing to reopen the case.
Now, homosexuality had been decriminalized in New South Wales in 1984, just 4 years before Johnson's death. And yet, Asad, violence against members of the LGBTQ community was not only very common, but also rarely investigated. As previously discussed, homophobic gangs frequently targeted gay men in the North Head region. Some men fell to their death, some disappeared, others were robbed. So this was a common occurrence. It didn't just happen to one person.
Right.
And yet, the police often looked the other way. According to BBC News, it is now estimated that up to 80 gay men fell victim to such crimes in Sydney during this period. At the time, Johnson's brother Steve knew nothing of such attacks, yet he remained insistent that his brother had not committed suicide. Because he knew his brother, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
However, everything changed in 2005. Now we are jumping to 2005 because from 1989 until 2005, nothing much happened. But in 2005, Johnson's partner, Noon, mailed Steve media reports regarding Operation Taradale. Now, for those who don't know, this was a police investigation surrounding cases from the 1980s in which gay men had either fallen to their deaths or disappeared near the seaside North Head Cliffs in Sydney, Australia.
Operation Taradale was basically just the police knowing that this shit was happening and trying to figure out why it was happening.
Exactly. So this was the first that Steve had heard of the gay beats in this region and their violent history. Driven by this discovery, Asad, Steve returned to Australia once more, begging the police department to reopen the investigation. He then hired a private investigator of his own. He even sought out the help of the detective conducting Operation Taradale. So he basically went all out, right? Despite these attempts, unfortunately, the case remained closed. However, the family continued to petition for further investigation. 7 years later, in 2012, the family's inquest demands were met, and a coroner's re-evaluation of Johnson's death revealed that the results were essentially inconclusive. In other words, the coroner was unable to determine exactly how Johnson had died.
The coroner was basically saying he looked at the body, looked at the death, and said it wasn't for sure suicide. We can't figure out what it was, and so they're going to reopen the case and figure it out.
Right. But the coroner could have said this in 1988, Asad.
Right, yeah.
Whoever the coroner at the time was, right? Now, this allowed police to reopen the investigation, now aware of the possibility of a gay hate crime. Following the 2012 inquest, the popular TV show Australian Story broadcast a report of Johnson's death, publicizing the case. Sometimes, Asad, I think that media attention and publicity becomes a necessary imperative for people to pay attention, for the law enforcement to pay attention, right? We see this time and again that at the end of the day, families of victims end up going to the media for help, right? Anyways, the family continued to push for further investigation, and in 2016, a third and final inquest was carried out. According to the Boston Globe, this time witnesses testified over the course of 13 days, spread across December 2016 and June 2017. The witnesses included men who frequently visited the region where Johnson's body had been found. These men confirmed that gay men often met in the North Head region in the 1980s and 90s. Some witnesses even mentioned reports of gay men being beaten or stabbed in North Head. Other witnesses included several gang members who admitted to waging such attacks in the 1980s. The coroner of the 2017 inquest therefore concluded that Scott Johnson had likely been killed in a hate crime. But the investigation continued. In September of 2018, in response to Steve's persistent efforts, the New South Wales Parliament launched a formal inquiry regarding police handling of gay and transgender hate crimes from 1970 to 2010. The police department then formed a special force called Strike Force Welsford to reinvestigate Scott Johnson's death. The department offered a reward of 1 million Australian dollars for information regarding the crime. In 2020, Johnson's brother Steve offered up to 1 million Australian dollar reward of his own, effectively doubling the total reward money.
Good on him, yeah.
Yeah, that very same year, Scott White's former wife Helen came forward to testify against her ex-husband, claiming that White had admitted to committing the crime.
Wow, okay.
According to The Guardian, in May of 2020, Scott White was arrested at his property in Lane Cove, Australia. This was an emotional and momentous moment for Steve Johnson and his family. Here's what Steve said.
My brother Scott was killed almost 32 years ago. The New South Wales police have now just apprehended the man that they believe is responsible for his death. This is a very emotional day. It's emotional for me, it's emotional for my family, my two sisters and my brother who love Scott dearly, my wife and my 3 kids who never got to know their uncle but admire him not only because of his brilliance but because he courageously lived his life as he wanted to. Emotional for the dozens of people who have been helping me in this fight for justice for decades. Emotional, I'm sure, for the gay community for whom Scott had come to symbolize the many dozens of other gay men who lost their lives in the 1980s and 90s in a world full of anti-gay prejudice and hatred. And I know that it's very emotional for the investigators. Scott would be very happy to see how far the gay community has come in 30 years toward living openly and freely as Scott believed everyone should.
So there's no doubt that this arrest would not have been possible had it not been for Steve's tireless, decades-long effort to bring justice to his brother Johnson, right?
What this tells me is, when you have loved ones who have passed in such a violent way with no explanation, it really consumes you and you want to find the answers, right? And so I really applaud what Scott's brother Steve has done. It also makes me think of all the victims who don't have the resources or the time or effort or manpower or loved ones to keep their stories front and center in the press or for investigators. And so, I think it's great what Steve did, but also makes me think of that other situation.
That's such an important point, Asad. Exactly. Steve ultimately accomplished not just for his brother, but for the rest of the LGBTQ plus community as well, right?
Yeah, sure.
According to a Boston Globe interview, a Legislative Council member and deputy leader of the New South Wales Labour Party, Penny Sharp, had this to say about Steve's efforts, and I quote, "Through his sheer persistence in finding justice for Scott, he's managed to force the police and the political leaders to confront a very sad period in Sydney. He's allowed Australia and Sydney to open up about a scary time for the gay and transgender community and let us face that and talk about that," unquote. In 2018, a report published by the New South Wales Police Force concluded that the department had in fact ignored gay hate crimes between 1976 and 2000. A new task force then determined that out of 86 deaths examined during this period, 27 contained evidence of strong bias,
Wow.
suggesting possible hate crimes. That's a huge number, Asad.
Almost a third. Yeah, that's crazy. Okay.
Now, we know that much of this newfound awareness was brought to the fore by Steve Johnson. In an interview with the Boston Globe, he said, and I quote, "Now I feel like I am representing not just Scott, but the other victims as well, even the gay community that is benefiting from the attention that this case has created toward the inequality of police protection and delivery of justice in that country," unquote.
Sally, this is just wild. I feel like we never have stories in which the families are able to accomplish, their goals when they set out. Like usually, fortunately, family members pass away or whatever. But sounds like a really intense 30 years of fighting for justice for Scott by his brother and his family. Really just inspiring stuff. What happened next? I'm assuming that there was some sort of trial for Scott White.
There was indeed, Asad. The 49-year-old perpetrator was immediately brought in for questioning following his arrest. In 2020, White initially pleaded not guilty. However, he took his lawyers by surprise in January of 2022 when he spontaneously pleaded, and I quote, "guilty, guilty, guilty."
Wow.
Yep, to murdering Johnson during a pre-trial hearing. Just 20 minutes later, White's lawyers had him sign a statement that he had been confused and had not meant to plead guilty to Johnson's death. This is pretty messed up.
Yeah.
However, the judge refused to accept the statement, recording White's initial guilty plea and sentencing him to 12 years and 7 months in prison. I am not sure if judges can do that, Asad.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the legal system in Australia to understand how this all works and what's admissible and what's not admissible. But it is wild to think that if, someone says something in court and then changes his opinion in a written statement, that the judge can determine which one he believes. That's really fascinating to me.
Yeah. So judge was ultimately unable to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the murder had been a hate crime, which would have lengthened White's sentence. The following November, however, 3 judges in the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal located in Sydney appealed White's conviction and sentence, ruling that he should have been permitted to reverse his guilty plea. And that makes sense, right? With White's conviction overturned, the case returned to court. Now, it seems like White may have attempted to fight all charges if it weren't for a record of a police interception of a prison phone call between White and his niece in October 2022. In that call, Asad, White confessed to punching Scott Johnson on the clifftop that fateful day in 1988.
Wow.
Given this damning information, in February of 2023, White was forced into a plea deal in which he pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter. For this, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, 6 of which he would not be eligible for parole. However, once again, the judge was unable to prove beyond reasonable doubt that White's actions had been a hate crime. Now, I don't understand why judge has to prove this. This part is really confusing to me.
Yeah, I don't know if our listeners know anything about the Australian legal system, especially when it comes to hate crimes. Let us know. We'd love to understand, how this works.
Having already served part of his sentence, White will be eligible for release on parole in 2026.
Yeah, Saadia, this is such an interesting story. I'm glad that you shared it. I think that the fact that, as we said, the family fought for so long to keep this, front and center. And then for when the case was reopened, that, we learned more about what was happening to gay Australians in terms of hate crimes or potential hate crimes. And then, the fact that White admitted it's great that he's serving his sentence now. And it's a really fascinating case. So, Saadia, with that, do you want to go to our primary question for the episode? Can Scott Johnson's death be considered a hate crime? What do you think?
Absolutely, Asad. Let's dive in. Now, this case is tricky as there are no witnesses. There is very little proof of what truly occurred, right? What was the motivation? Maybe they got into an argument and White just punched Johnson because White was angry and not because Johnson was gay, right? But here are a few things that I would really want our listeners to pay attention to. Scott Johnson's body was found in a region known to be frequented by gay men looking for consensual sex. That's one. This also made this region a frequent target for homophobic gangs who were known to have attacked these men, occasionally pushing them off the cliff, something that White did, right? Scott White may therefore have lured Scott Johnson to the cliff intending to attack him or push him off the cliff. This is something that could have happened. On the other hand, this may also suggest that there was some kind of relationship between Johnson and White, suggesting a potential crime of passion. But I said before we talk more, I want to get your opinion. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's just too many unknowns, right? Like we can both come up with hypotheses that could say that clearly it was a hate crime because of all the context surrounding it, but like I think equally plausible is like maybe they didn't know each other or maybe they just got into a fight right then and there and he tripped and fell and after the punch and fell off the cliff. Like I think unfortunately the only person that knows that's still alive is Scott White, and I don't think he's sharing what he thought or even if he remembers, how he was feeling at the time. So I think for me, there's not enough information to determine whether or not this was a hate crime. I think that clearly there are a lot of indications that it could be based on, as you said, the location and the circumstances, but like there's too much uncertainty for us to make that determination, in my opinion.
I think you're right. I am unable to make a determination as well, although I have a lot of questions and I do tilt more towards it being a hate crime. But then again, we don't have enough evidence, so it's difficult to point in one direction.
So, Saadia, where is Scott White today?
So, he continues to serve his sentence in prison, where he will likely remain until at least 2026. As for Scott Johnson's brother Steve, he continues to grieve the loss of his brother over 35 years later. According to the Boston Globe, as of 2019, Steve continued to visit the cliff where his brother lost his life, imagining Johnson's final moments and honoring his memory. He hopes to one day learn even more about the circumstances surrounding the death of his beloved brother. In an interview with ABC News, here's what Steve said.
I'll always hope that someday he'll find it in his heart to maybe tell us a little bit more about why he was there with my brother and what his intention was.
So we can only hope that Steve and the rest of his family continue to heal from this tragic loss and go on to lead happy and healthy lives in whatever form they come, right? Because life will never be normal for them ever again.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Saadia. And, I think that just like in American society, Australian society has been far more accepting of the LGBTQ community now than it was in the 1980s, and that's definitely a positive sign. And according to BBC News, the New South Wales Police Department has formally apologized to the Johnson family for failing to properly investigate the case back in 1988, recognizing that it failed to protect the gay community. The department remains more sensitive to such matters today, they say, and has attempted to fix its prior mistakes. However, unfortunately, to this day, still many members of the LGBTQ community continue to face violence and discrimination across Australia. So, Saadia, is there anything that listeners can do to help?
Asad, while there's no direct way to aid in response to a 35-year-old crime, listeners can support the protection and advancement of LGBTQ rights in Australia by donating to nonprofit organizations such as Minus 18, Equality Australia, Q Life, and Pride Foundation Australia. With that, we conclude yet another episode of Invisible Hate. If you have any stories, if you have any ideas about what we should cover, if you know somebody that you want us to interview on this podcast, please send us your suggestions. Thank you again for listening to Invisible Hate. If you want to learn more, check out links in the show notes about the case. Please email us your thoughts on this story especially. We covered a story that was not based in the US. We don't understand Australian law. So if you have any thoughts, any insights, please do share with us. You can reach us at info@invisiblehatepodcast.com. You can also tweet us or hit us up on Instagram. Just search for Invisible Hate Podcast.
You can also find Saadia at investment club meetings across the New York City.
Oh, yeah. And if you are an investor, reach out to me.
Yeah, totally. Thanks again for listening. Invisible Hate is a joint production of Rafaelion Media and Immigrantly. We'd like to thank our team, which includes Michaela Strather, Minion Onehan, Lindsay Gamble, and Paroma Chakravarthi. And our music was done by Simon Hutchinson. We'll be back, as always, next week with a hate crime for us to analyze. Until then, I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.